Okay, in this lesson, we're going to talk about trauma-induced grief and how it's different from regular grief and how it's connected to complex PTSD. The thing to understand is that we often in the mental health field talk about grief and trauma all in this sort of one big mass. And it's not the best way to talk about it to help us heal. The truth is, if we separate the trauma, the triggers from the grief and understand what's happening when we're looking at what's going on in our bodies, it's much easier to heal the trauma and to eliminate the long-term impact of the trauma in our lives. So let's get going. We want to start with really talking about the difference between trauma and grief. So they have huge differences, even though they get lumped into the same categories. One of the things that makes complex PTSD and living with it and trying to figure out how to heal it confusing is that we don't spend enough time separating it. So let's do that. So let's start with trauma. So trauma involves exposure to something. It's exposure to a threat. So it's either serious or threatened death, serious or threatened injury, sexual trauma, or emotional violence. So those are the characteristics. Now, emotional violence is anything, yelling, especially when we're talking about childhood PTSD or developmental trauma. It's yelling, it's name calling, it's blaming, it's shaming. All of that stuff is traumatic, especially to a child who's trying to develop a sense of who they are and a sense of security and a sense of emotional well-being. It can't happen in an abusive home. And it's something we have to look at and really face and deal with when we're talking about how do I heal my childhood or complex PTSD? So all of those traumatic events, whether we're talking about exposure to actual or threatened death, to serious injury, to sexual or emotional violence, happen in several different ways. The first one is by direct experience. This means that something has actually happened to you. The second is by witnessing an event or events. So one of the things to understand about this is that children who live in a home where someone is being harmed, that child doesn't necessarily have to be receiving abuse themselves, but witnessing abuse is traumatic. There are even some studies that suggest that the trauma that is witnessed by a sibling who is not physically harmed themselves is more damaging to the sibling who did not receive any physical harm than it is to the child who was actually abused. Now, I don't know whether or not that's true, but I'm telling you this because if you are a sibling of somebody who was in the home and you watched that, it had to have affected your emotional well-being. So witnessing an event is significant. The next one is learning about something that occurred to a close family member or friend. So in September 11th, 2001, I lost my aunt, my favorite aunt, who I had lived with and nannied her children. She was in the Pentagon and they hit her office directly. I wasn't there. I didn't witness it directly, but I heard about it and learned about it as the events unfold. That was a traumatic experience for me. So it took me 10 years to not be triggered by discussions of that event. And then learning about something that occurred to a family member is a legitimate trauma if it causes trauma responses in us. The last one is repeated exposure. And this is what happens most often when a child has been exposed to trauma, to traumatic events, any of them that are listed above there in their home they grew up in. It's almost always serious repeated exposure. So what is grief? Grief then is the intense emotional response to the things that happen. So the actual threatened death, the serious injury, sexual or emotional violence that results in loss. So if the trauma led to a loss, and it almost always does, if you think about your own childhood trauma, many trauma survivors spend time feeling bad about the loss of having had the kind of parent they believe they should have had, or they know that they should have deserved. Any kind of loss that comes as we're looking back on what happened and realizing that something was missing, and our struggle today can be counted back to the thing that happened to us, whether it's loss of time, loss of self-confidence, loss of self-esteem, loss of a dream of what's hoped for, the loss of ability to develop secure relationships or to receive comfort in relationships. All of those losses can usually be traced back for somebody who's experienced childhood trauma to specific traumatic events. That's grief. Trauma, the main emotional response to trauma is fear. Now, the thing to know is that some people really do, when they're triggered, act angry instead of afraid. The reason for this is that it's much more powerful to get angry than it is to feel vulnerable in fear. But people get angry because they don't want to stay afraid. So it's a much more activated state, and it feels more powerful, but it comes from the same feelings at the root. So as I've said before, grief is the emotional response to loss. Trauma always involves some kind of loss. Okay, so that's the thing to remember. Grief is about the loss. Trauma is about the threat or the danger. It's two different things, and we need to treat them differently. So because trauma involves loss, the trauma response of fear and grief are often experienced at the same time. So if you think about your childhood trauma and the experiences that you had with the parent that you were experiencing trauma from, small children often work very hard to try to please the parent who's causing them harm. And when the parent who's causing them harm doesn't stop causing them harm, even though the child is trying very hard to be pleasing, that child experiences loss and there is a grief. But because the child cannot tolerate the hope and the grief at the same time, and because the grief involves a real coming to awareness of what's not possible for them or what's not available for them in terms of what they need to survive from their parent, child usually shuts that off, doesn't feel that pushes through. So think about the grief of childhood trauma as having a cumulative effect that we actually, it builds in our body over time. That's why if you're a person who never received comfort in your relationship with your parent, and you felt a sense of emptiness and loss while you were growing up, you'll look for someone outside of you who will fill up that sense of emptiness for you. But you'll look for it from people who look too much like your parents. So one of the things a parent is supposed to do is a parent is supposed to teach us how to fill up those spaces in ourselves by first mirroring it for us. And when they do that, then the child will leave childhood saying, oh, I'm good enough. I can take care of myself. I'm okay. I'm okay. I can move through this. But somebody who's had childhood trauma doesn't ever learn how to do that. So the mistake is continuing to look for that outside of ourselves. Part of the healing, which involves grief, is as an adult, acknowledging the loss of that nurturing that the parent never gave, and acknowledging the loss of the skill for self-soothing that never came from the parent, working through that grief, healing those triggers to then be able to grow to the developmental place of giving ourselves more support and giving ourselves more comfort and learning how to get through things that are hard without looking for someone outside of us to rescue us. I talk more about this as we work through triggers and understanding the developmental gaps that are held open. So there's the developmental gap that I just described about being able to soothe ourselves. Once you heal the trigger of going through something hard and looking for someone to rescue, that trigger, once that's healed, self-soothing can be achieved. And it's a developmental piece that has to be done in the right order. But this is a good example of understanding how the trauma, the fear, the sense of lack of confidence, and grief, because nobody was there to give you what you needed, go together at the same time. So what is grief? Elizabeth Kubler-Ross spoke about grief. And when she did, she talked about it in 5 stages. Now, since then, there's been a 6th stage added, and it makes a lot of sense to me when we talk about healing trauma. So I wanted to include that in this slide. The first stage, and I'm going to talk about grief generally, and then later I'm going to tell you how it specifically applies to childhood trauma. The first is shock or denial. And so it's shock or denial that the thing that just happened actually happened. It's the body's mechanism for helping us gear up for helping to get through that traumatic experience or the loss. Okay, so the denial and shock gives the body a chance to get the hormones and things going that need to be going to get us through that spurt of fight or flight, whatever it is that we need to be doing to get through that experience of trauma or loss. Once we get through the denial and shock, the next stage is anger about what happened. Anger about what happened. And then once the anger subsides, a sense of bargaining, because there's been a loss. Remember, grief is about loss. So because there's been a loss, the next stage is to try to figure out how to avoid feeling the reality, the weight of the loss. So this is the time when there's been a loss, a traumatic event, something that's happened, where people will often look back at what happened, searching for ways to have figured out how they could have avoided it. If I'd just done this, maybe it wouldn't have happened that way. Happens when a parent has a child who's ill. It happens when there's been something devastating that's happened. It happens after a car accident. There's all kinds of bargaining that some people bargain with God to avoid grief, but that's what bargaining is. And then once we realize that we cannot find a way to bargain our way away from the loss, then depression, severe sadness steps in. And that is really kind of sort of becoming aware of the inability to avoid the loss. Then depression or sadness has its own pace. It has its own cycle. Once we get through that cycle of sadness and depression, which by the way, in grief, it should take no more than 6 months. If it's more than 6 months in the DSM-5, they consider it complicated grief. So there is a certain period of time that should be allowed for sadness. And beyond that, we should be looking at what's keeping a person stuck in that stage of grief. Because after the sadness is a sense of acceptance. Okay, life is new. The way that we're going to interact with life and people and things is different now because of the loss. But okay, I'm ready. I'm going to take a deep breath and I'm going to move forward in this sense of awareness that life has changed and I'm going to move through it. And then finally, sometimes we can make meaning of our loss. So when we talk about making meaning of loss, one of the things that I identify with is because my trauma started when I was very young. So my first traumatic experience, I was 2. A couple of things were happening. By then, I know that my mom was already verbally and physically being aggressive with me. And my dad ran me over with a flatbed truck, which caused an injury that now I still deal with, which is a paralyzed diaphragm. That trauma started when I was 2 and then was followed by a series of domestic violence relationships, actually emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. All the while, I'm trying to figure out how to change the patterns in me that made me attracted to people who would do those kinds of things. I finally figured that out. I'm 54 years old. I'll be 55 this year. And I've had a trauma-free life for 2 years. So if we take off the 54, the 4 years without trauma, I've had 50 years of trauma. As I worked through the grief associated with that, here's the meaning I've made. I really believe that I was put on this earth, born to the family I was born to, with the kind of questioning mind that I have, because it is my job. The reason I'm on the earth is to teach people how to heal from CPTSD. That's my meaning. That's the thing that gets me going in the morning. That's the thing that has me shedding tears for people who haven't found the answers yet, knowing that through my whole life, I was looking for support and answers for about 8 years from therapists who really didn't know what to do with trauma, really didn't know how to heal it. So that's my sense of meaning. And everybody finds different meaning based on who they are and what their experiences in life are related to grief. So inside the Trauma Erase Method Academy, we address the responses to trauma and how to heal them specifically by talking about how to heal triggers. So if you think of a trigger, the triggering event being at the core, every single time something happens that reinforces that trigger, so whether it's a new event that makes you really sure that that thing that you're afraid of is something you should be afraid of, anytime an experience adds to it, anytime you talk about it and makes your fear worse, we like build this real big bundle that on the very deep inside holds the trigger. The bundle is all of the emotional energy that adds up over time to make the fear about that thing that feels scary feel real and feel like the truth, even though it may have nothing to do with what your life is about right now. In the Trauma Erase Method Academy, I teach you how to heal the trigger. Because when you heal the trigger, all of that emotional energy that was around it, holding it in place in your body, gets released. When it gets released, then you're free to do the grief work so that you can actually fully, systematically heal yourself from the effect of trauma in your life. So let's talk about how grief interacts with PTSD. The thing I really want you to understand is that I want you to think about the grief responses as those feelings that you have about the trigger once the trigger has been released. So I'm going to give you an example. I speak on my website, the Center for Healing Trauma.com, about the day that I got a trigger response because my fiance brought me a glass of warm lemon water while I was sitting in bed reading in the morning. I was there reading a spiritual book, and he just came in and quietly handed me the warm glass of lemon water and walked away. As he's walking away after doing this very loving, sweet thing, I immediately started to cry. The thought in my head was, I don't deserve this. And like I got into a triggered state. It took me about an hour to work through that triggered state. So it took me about an hour to go, wait a minute. As soon as I started crying and realized I didn't feel worthy, I knew that the reason I had that thought, I'm not worthy, I don't deserve this, is because when I was growing up, I was not allowed rest time. If I spent more time than was expected in bed, and by the way, I had asthma and I was very hardworking, so sometimes I was exhausted and needed to rest. But if I rested, I was called lazy, I was screamed at, I was forced to get out of bed and clean the house. I was essentially the maid. It didn't matter how I felt, didn't matter the expression on my face. None of that mattered. So this morning, as he brings me this water, I'm already breaking the rule and staying in bed when I could be up and helping, right? But I actually had chosen to stay in bed and read, which my fiance supports. However, the act of staying in bed and reading is a broken rule, a broken should that was set in place based on my family of origin. And the act of bringing me water was a validation of who I am, which had never happened before. So that old rule in my head triggered me so that I didn't feel safe or comfortable receiving validation from someone who loves me in a safe environment. So it took me about an hour to figure that out. Took me about an hour to calm down my trauma brain and my body history so that it wasn't overreacting, so that I could speak about what had happened. And as soon as I eliminated the trigger, as I'd calmed it down, and it's never happened again, as soon as I calmed it down, then the grief comes on. Now, I've been working through grief about childhood trauma for many years, many years. And so I didn't have to start at shock and denial, but I did get angry. I got angry. So that's the next thing that happened. For about 15 minutes after I shared with my partner what had happened, and it was obvious, he could see it, but I said, here's what happened. Here's what happened to me this morning when you brought me that water. Thank you, by the way. And here's what happened. I got mad. And my words were something like this: I'm really angry that my mother's actions made me feel afraid when you did something loving toward me. I verbalized it. I felt really very intensely angry for several minutes. I got the energy out of my body safely without taking it out on anyone else. And then, no real sadness. I went straight to acceptance. But the grief is the feeling about the thing that I had to heal, the trigger that I had to eliminate. So I hope that makes sense to you. The thing I also want you to understand is that people often talk about the cycle of grief as if it's a cycle where you start, something happens, you go straight to denial, and then the next step is anger, and then you bargain, and then you feel depression, and then it's acceptance. It doesn't work like that. Here's how it works. So the ladybug, one ladybug is going from acceptance back to depression. Another one's starting at anger and then going to acceptance, which is what I did over the glass of water. Somebody stays in denial. Another one goes from bargaining and back to anger and back to denial again. That's what the path through grief looks like. It often feels random. And many times it may be, but when we're talking about any theme connected to your childhood trauma, the reality is that you have to work through all of these stages connected to your grief before that aspect will be healed. And it makes sense, and it is progressive, but it's not linear. So don't be surprised if you get back to anger again on the same thing, or you're back to bargaining again, especially when we're talking about childhood trauma. Bargaining really is connected to who we become when we go back to our family of origin because we're trying to get acceptance that just isn't going to happen if our family hasn't changed. So, another aspect of complete healing that I want you to understand that's connected to healing grief is being able to heal individual trauma themes. So, the reason I've put a puzzle here is because it's really important to understand when you're putting a puzzle together. If you've done a jigsaw puzzle, sometimes you can pick up a piece and look at that piece and think, this isn't even part of this puzzle. What the heck? And then you start putting together the whole thing. And then later you pick up the same piece that didn't make any sense at all. And suddenly you know exactly where it goes and you can pop it right into the spot that it belongs. So that's what this process looks like. And so you might be working through different stages of grief connected to different trauma themes, but larger areas of understanding become clear as you work through the healing process. So first, I want to tell you what grief related to PTSD looks like specifically when we're talking about childhood trauma. So the first one is denial or shock. So this often happens when, for example, an adult is asked to look back at childhood to start pulling apart what's happened, right? So one of the things that will happen often is that I will ask someone to identify what in their body history is connected to the current trigger. And many times people who've been raised to respect their parents, and there's nothing wrong with that, will actually have a lot of difficulty identifying that the reason they have something in their body history that's causing them pain is because their parent did something wrong to them. So that level of denial and shock is coming to the recognition that your parent wasn't the parent that they were supposed to be. Instead, denial looks like there's something wrong with me, because if there wasn't something wrong with me, then my parent would have treated me in the way I should have been treated. That's denial connected to childhood trauma. There is no way that healing childhood trauma is about parent bashing. That's not what this is about. But it's about looking at what actually happened and placing the responsibility for what happened where it belonged. The second stage where someone could get stuck because of childhood trauma is in anger. This is the person who gets angry at everyone around them for things that their parent did to them. That anger lingers in their body, and instead of recognizing where it's coming from and recognizing that it's their job now as an adult to work through the anger and heal themselves, this person is angry at everyone around them. This person is angry when somebody makes a mistake. Person is angry when someone reminds them of something that happened when they were young. This is a person who lashes out and says, it's not my fault. I can't help it. It's something that you did. It's never, ever an excuse. If I was hurt as a child, there's no excuse for me to pass that forward to someone else in anger because I was hurt. Instead, that's unresolved grief and unfinished childhood healing that has to happen. Okay? The next step in grief related to childhood trauma and PTSD is bargaining. That's being connected still to the family of origin that you're in a way where you're still trying to get approval. You're still trying to please the person who hurt you in the first place. You're still taking on roles and behaviors and attitudes that please the other people instead of taking care of yourself. Many, many children, many adults who grew up with childhood trauma still do that. And if they're not doing that in the family of origin that they grew up in, they're doing it in their relationships with people who they've partnered with that look a lot like their family of origin. Believe me, I did this for 30 years. You choose someone who looks a lot like the people who hurt you, because somewhere in the subconscious, if I can get that person to love me the way my family of origin didn't, then maybe I'm okay. The problem is that kind of bargaining never, ever works. It doesn't ever work. But we tend to stay stuck in those relationships because we believe and hope, like a child with unending hope, that we can't get away or that it will change if we just keep doing things right. Believe me, I spent 14 years in my first marriage doing that very thing until I realized that I was never going to get what I needed as long as I stayed there. The next stage is depression. So it's recognizing that the family of origin that you came from or the person that hurt you is never going to change. One of the things that I hear from people who were hurt in childhood is that they want to confront their abuser. The confronting of the abuser comes with the hope that the abuser will say, "You're right, I'm sorry. You were right, I was wrong." Guess what? That happened. In my early 40s, about 10 years ago, I went to my parents and said, "Hey, Mom, did you know that when you were beating me up, I couldn't say beating me up because she couldn't tolerate that? But when we were having that hard time when Dad was at work, no one ever came to see if I was okay at the end of the day." She did. And she said, "Oh, you didn't? Nobody came?" And I said, "No." And she said, "I'm so sorry." Then I went to my dad. "Hey, Dad, did you know that when I was little and you'd go to work, Mom used to beat me up?" He said, "Oh my God, why didn't you tell me?" Like, well, "Hi, Dad, could you imagine a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old? Hi, Dad, Mom beat me up today." It just doesn't happen. So Dad said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." And I cried in his arms and cried and cried and cried. Did that change them? No. It's still always my fault if Mom isn't happy. It's still always my fault if something goes wrong. It's still me being selfish if I'm taking care of myself instead of making myself selfless for their unending needs. So realizing that and still trying to get the needs met, or realizing that and recognizing it's time to let go, can lead to some profound sadness. But that profound sadness can then lead to some very intense, positive, nurturing relationships when you learn to let go of the things that were hurting you. So after depression is acceptance, recognizing the people for who they are and understanding that if you're going to change and grow and heal, you have to do it. And then finally making meaning. And I've already explained that to you. So the next thing on this slide that I want to describe to you is the categories of loss. So people think that this grief process is an ongoing process. But what I want you to understand is that we have to grieve the categories of loss, and we have to grieve them sufficiently to be able to let go in that specific themed area. So right here, I've only listed 3 of them, but I want to give you 3 of them to help you understand what I'm talking about. The first one is grief about our parents' consistent, unloving behaviors. This is grief about not having the parent who was good enough to make you safe, to make you feel secure, to make you feel loved. Another category is the loss of time. So I've told you about how much trauma I've had in my own life. And believe me, my biggest grief has been time I've lost repeating cycles, time I've lost self-sabotaging. I have 50 years to look back at times where I hurt myself, times where I allowed other people to hurt me, times where I didn't say no and stand up to myself. So loss of time is a big area of grief for us. And then the third one is those intangible losses, like the losses of the potential to have had a healthy relationship, but we didn't know how to receive comfort in relationship. The losses connected to social skills that we never developed. Kids with good enough parents figure out how to tell the difference between a friend and not a friend. Kids with parents like yours and mine were told the only people you can trust is us, and don't trust anybody outside of the family. Guess what? That's what parents say when there are secrets to hide. Parents of good enough parents of kids who grow and develop normally are taught to go out into the world to experiment, to learn who's safe and who's not safe, and to come back and share those lessons and learnings with their parent. And the parent guides them to learn how to navigate the world outside of the home on their own. So we have grief that we didn't get those pieces. All of those are areas, and they're going to be different for each person. Some of them are universal, but it's those themed pieces that have to be grieved. Inside the Trauma Erasing Method Academy, I have a newsletter called the Monthly Skill Builder, where we work each month inside a social group talking about the developmental gaps that we were left with because of childhood trauma and how to close those gaps, how to look at what triggers are keeping the gaps open and what to do to help ourselves heal and move to where we should have been had our parents given us what we needed. So from this lesson, one of the things that I want you to take away is I want you to focus on releasing all of the emotion from your body history. Remember when I said that a trigger is encased with layers of emotion that makes that trigger feel super real? The ways that we can release it to help it feel less intense so that we can navigate through are several things we could do. Journaling, and journaling, not just like random journaling, but what happened? What does this remind me of? What were the thoughts that I had? What are the feelings that are out of control? And where are the choices for me? Like what happened? How does this make sense? That's what journaling should be about. Second is exercise. If you hold something in your mind, in your body, while you exercise something that bothers you, it can actually discharge some of the energy that is being held around a trigger to help you release it. The other is crying, screaming, or scream singing. Do it safely. So after that 14-year marriage, when I realized how much my husband was like my mom, I discovered Alanis Morissette and spent hours scream singing with her in the car. It lets emotional energy out, especially when the emotions being described in the song connect with the losses that you're trying to work through. Talking, of course, helps, but it shouldn't be talking about being triggered. It should be talking about the losses that come after the trigger is healed. Okay. Then the last one, my picture is over it, but it's embodiment exercises. It's ways to work with the body. And we talk about this in the later chapters of the course, but your body and mind were all present when the trauma happened. So the body and mind both have to be connected and involved in the process of releasing the trauma. The final takeaway now, the wrap up, is that I want you to understand in healing, first you eliminate the fear from a PTSD trigger. And then it's time to super nurture yourself through the grief about the losses that are caused by the trauma. That's how you go about healing and eliminating the long-term impact of trauma in your life. So I hope this was enjoyable for you. I hope you learned a lot. I hope it adds to your life. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.